When a Comanche warrior finds a half-drowned woman floating in the Texas River, he has no idea that saving her life will bind them together in ways that will challenge everything both their worlds believe about love, loyalty, and survival. But as her past comes hunting for her through the winter snow, will their forbidden bond be strong enough to withstand the forces determined to tear them apart? The arrow missed the deer's heart by inches, sinking deep into the oak tree behind it instead. Ayanna cursed under his breath as the white-tailed buck bounded away through the morning mist, its hooves splashing across the shallow waters of the Brazos River. He had been tracking this animal since before sunrise, and now his empty stomach would have to wait even longer for food. The young Comanche warrior stood knee-deep in the cold Texas water, watching his breakfast disappear into the thick fog that clung to the riverbank like smoke from a dying campfire. It was late autumn in 1847, and the air carried the sharp bite of winter's approach. Soon, his band would need to move to their protected canyon for the cold months ahead, but first they needed meat to dry and store. Ayanna waded toward the tree to retrieve his arrow, his moccasins finding solid footing on the smooth river stones beneath the surface. At 23 winters old, he had earned his place among the best hunters of his people, but this morning felt different somehow. The usual sounds of the river were muted, as if the water itself was holding its breath. His grandmother had taught him to listen to such feelings. "Puha speaks through all things," she would say, referring to the spiritual power that flowed through the world like blood through veins. The wise man pays attention when the spirits whisper. As he pulled the arrow from the oak's trunk, checking its point for damage, Ayanna heard something that made him freeze. It was barely audible over the gentle gurgling of the current, but there it was again, a soft splash, different from the natural rhythm of the water. He tucked the arrow into his quiver and moved upstream, his dark eyes scanning the surface for whatever had disturbed the peace of his hunting ground. The mist swirled around him like ghostly fingers as he walked, making it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. His people had always been comfortable with mystery, understanding that some things revealed themselves only when the time was right. But this morning, the fog seemed to hide something important, something that made his heart beat faster with anticipation. A fish jumped nearby, its silver body catching what little light filtered through the gray morning sky, before disappearing back into the depths. Ayanna paused, remembering his father's words about patience in hunting. The prey will come to you if you become part of the river itself. He had always been good at becoming invisible, at moving without disturbing the world around him. But today, the world seemed already disturbed. The sound came again, closer this time, and Ayanna felt the hair on his arms stand up beneath his buckskin shirt. It was not the splash of a fish or the movement of river debris. This was something else entirely, something that made his hand drift toward the bone handle of his knife without conscious thought. He moved forward carefully, each step placed with the silent precision his people had perfected over countless generations. The ability to move unseen had kept the Comanche alive in a world that was changing too quickly, where white settlers pressed ever westward with their wagons and their hunger for land. Through the mist, a shape began to emerge on the water's surface. At first, Ayanna thought it might be a fallen log, carried downstream by the current. But as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. The shape was too regular, too purposeful in its movement to be random debris. It was pale, almost white in the dim morning light, and it moved with the slow, deliberate motion of something that was not quite dead but not fully alive either. Ayanna's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized what he was seeing, though his mind struggled to accept it. A woman floated face up in the water, her blonde hair spread around her head like dried grass in the wind. Her dress, once probably white or cream-colored, now clung to her body like a burial shroud, heavy with river water and mud. Her skin had the blue-gray color of someone who had been in cold water too long, and her lips were nearly purple. But her chest rose and fell in tiny, desperate movements. She was alive, barely, held at the surface by some miracle of current and luck. A broken branch had caught the fabric of her dress, keeping her face just above the waterline that separated life from death. Ayana stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. In all his years of hunting along this river, he had never seen anything like this. Women did not simply appear in the water like fish or fallen leaves. Someone had put her there, and that someone had meant for her to die. The warrior in him screamed caution. This could be a trap, a way to lure him into danger. White settlers were known for their tricks, their willingness to use anything, even their own women, to gain an advantage over his people. But something deeper than caution moved in Ayana's chest as he watched the woman's faint struggle for breath. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory. Every life carries sacred power. To ignore a life in danger is to ignore the spirits themselves. Without another moment's hesitation, Ayana plunged into the deeper water, his buckskin clothing instantly soaked through by the cold current. The shock of the temperature hit him like a physical blow, but he pushed forward, fighting against the river's pull as he reached for the floating woman. Her body was lighter than he expected, as if the water had already begun to hollow her out from the inside. Up close, he could see that she was young, probably not much older than himself, with delicate features that spoke of a life spent indoors, protected from the harsh realities of frontier existence. But there was something else too, something that made Ayana's jaw tighten with anger. Dark bruises marked her throat and wrists, the unmistakable signs of violence. Someone had not just thrown her into the river, they had hurt her first, badly enough to leave marks that would last for weeks. As he lifted her from the water, cradling her limp form against his chest, Ayana felt a surge of protective fury, unlike anything he had experienced before. This woman, whoever she was, had been betrayed by people who should have protected her. The thought made his blood run hot, despite the cold water swirling around his legs. Her eyelids fluttered as he carried her toward the bank, and for just a moment he saw the blue of her eyes, the color of prairie sky after a storm. Then they closed again, and her breathing became even more shallow. Ayana knew he had to act quickly. The cold was killing her, as surely as drowning would have, and he was still miles from his band's camp. But he also knew these riverbanks like the lines on his own palm, and there was shelter nearby, if he could reach it in time. As he laid her on the muddy shore and began pressing water from her lungs, Ayana wondered what forces had brought this strange woman to his river on this particular morning. His grandmother would have said it was fate, that the spirits had guided him here for a purpose he did not yet understand. Whatever the reason, he knew his life had just changed forever. The woman in his arms was more than just a person in need of rescue. She was a mystery wrapped in tragedy. And something deep in his warrior's heart told him that solving that mystery would require more courage than he had ever needed before. Tsawinoka? The Comanche word slipped from Ayana's lips like a prayer as he knelt beside the unconscious woman on the riverbank. What is this? The question hung in the cold morning air as he worked to save her life, his hands moving with practiced efficiency born from years of treating hunting injuries and battle wounds. But this was different. This was not an accident, or the result of combat. This was deliberate cruelty, and it made his stomach turn with disgust. Water poured from her mouth as he pressed on her chest, each expelled breath a small victory against death itself. Her skin was like ice beneath his touch, so cold it seemed to burn his fingertips. He had pulled drowning children from streams before, had seen what the river could do to the human body, but he had never encountered someone who had been in the water this long and still lived. The bruises on her throat were clearer now, dark purple marks that spoke of strong hands and violent intent. Someone had tried to strangle her before throwing her into the river, probably thinking the water would finish what they had started. The realization made Ayana's jaw clench with barely controlled rage. He stripped off his buckskin shirt and wrapped it around her shivering form, knowing that warmth was as important as breathing in, fighting off the cold death that reached for her with invisible fingers. Her lips were still blue, but he could see the faintest hint of pink beginning to return to her cheeks. "Puha, give me strength," he whispered, calling upon the spiritual power that guided his people as he gathered her into his arms. She was heavier now, waterlogged and limp, but something in her face, even unconscious and half-dead, spoke of inner strength that matched his own. The nearest shelter was a cave he had used many times during hunting trips, hidden beneath an overhanging cliff about a quarter-mile upstream. It would provide protection from the wind and a place to build a fire, both essential if this mysterious woman was going to survive the morning. As he carried her along the riverbank, Ayana found himself studying her face more carefully. Her features were delicate but not weak, with high cheekbones and a stubborn set to her jaw that suggested she was used to fighting for what she wanted. Her blonde hair, now darkened with river water, showed threads of copper when the weak sunlight touched it. She was beautiful, he realized, but it was not the pampered beauty of the white women he had occasionally seen at trading posts. This was something deeper, forged by experience and hardship. Even unconscious, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength, tested by fire. The cave entrance was partially hidden by a tangle of wild grapevines, their leaves now brown and brittle with approaching winter. Ayana had discovered this place as a boy, and it had become his private refuge over the years, a place where he could think and plan without the constant noise of camp life. Inside, the cave opened into a natural chamber, large enough for several people, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. The floor was covered with soft sand that had blown in over countless seasons, and there was a natural fire pit near the entrance where smoke could escape without revealing their location to unwanted visitors. Ayana laid the woman on a bed of dried grass he kept stored in the cave, then quickly began gathering materials for a fire. His movements were efficient and sure, the result of a lifetime spent living close to the edge of survival. Soon, flames danced in the stone circle, casting warm light on the cave walls and beginning to drive away the deadly cold. But even as he worked, part of his mind wrestled with larger questions. Who was this woman? Why had someone tried to kill her? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do with her now that he had saved her life? In Comanche tradition, there were rules about such things. A warrior who saved a life became responsible for that life, bound by honor and spiritual law to protect what he had rescued from death. But those rules had been written for situations involving fellow Comanche, not mysterious white women who appeared in rivers like gifts from the spirit world. As the fire grew stronger, Ayana began to examine his unexpected patient more carefully. The bruises on her throat were not the only signs of violence. Her wrists bore rope marks, and there were scratches on her arms that looked like she had fought desperately against her attackers. Whatever had happened to her, she had not gone quietly to her intended death. Her breathing was growing stronger now, more regular, though she still had not regained consciousness. Ayana found himself counting each breath, measuring it against the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He had never been responsible for a life hanging by such a thin thread, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him like a physical burden. He thought of his grandmother, the wisest person he had ever known, and wondered what she would say about this situation. The spirits work in mysterious ways, she might tell him. Sometimes they send us tests disguised as gifts and gifts disguised as tests. Was this woman a test or a gift? Ayana could not tell, but he knew that his life had changed the moment he pulled her from the river. There would be no going back to the simple certainties of hunting and fighting and following the ancient ways of his people. This woman, whoever she was shad, brought complexity into his world, and complexity was dangerous. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing toward the cave ceiling. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing a world that looked the same as it had an hour ago, but felt completely different. Somewhere out there, people were probably looking for this woman, and they would not be looking in order to help her. Ayana checked his weapon-sheath rifle, his knife, his bow and arrows, making sure everything was ready for whatever might come. He had learned long ago that survival often depended on being prepared for trouble before it arrived, and trouble, he sensed, was coming whether he was ready or not. The woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering without opening. A soft moan escaped her lips, the first sound she had made since he found her. It was a sound of pain and confusion, but also of life returning to a body that had almost given up its fight. Ayana leaned closer, studying her face for signs of consciousness. Her skin was warmer now, still pale but no longer the frightening blue-gray of near death. Her breathing had settled into a more natural rhythm, and he could see the subtle movements behind her closed eyelids that suggested dreams or perhaps nightmares were beginning to stir in her recovering mind. Who was she? The question echoed in his thoughts like a drumbeat. What had she done to deserve such violence? What enemies had she made? And how far would they go to finish what they had started? As if sensing his questions, the woman's eyes suddenly opened, staring directly into his own, with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke, each taking the measure of the other in the flickering firelight. Then fear flooded her blue eyes, and she tried to sit up, only to collapse back onto the grass bed with a gasp of pain and exhaustion. But in that brief moment of eye contact, Ayanna had seen something that told him everything he needed to know about this mysterious woman. She was not a victim, despite what had been done to her. She was a fighter, and she was far from finished fighting. The realization sent a thrill of recognition through him. He was looking at a kindred spirit, someone who understood that survival was not just about staying alive, but about refusing to let the world break you no matter how hard it tried. Whatever happened next, Ayanna knew he was no longer dealing with a helpless woman who needed rescue. He was dealing with a warrior who had been beaten but not defeated, and that changed everything about the dangerous game they were about to play. "Don't move, or I'll kill you where you sit." Elizabeth's voice cut through the cave like a blade, even though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Ayanna froze, his hand halfway to the water gourd he had been reaching for. The woman who had been unconscious moments before now sat upright against the cave wall, her blue eyes blazing with fierce determination despite the weakness that made her whole body shake. In her trembling grip, she held his own knife, the one he had carelessly left within her reach while tending the fire. "I don't know what you want from me," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "but I'd rather die fighting than let another man decide my fate." The irony of the situation was not lost on Ayanna. He had saved her life, and now she was threatening to take his. But instead of anger, he felt something closer to admiration. Even half dead and confused, she had managed to arm herself and take control of the situation. It was exactly what a Comanche warrior would do in unfamiliar territory. "I not hurt you," he said carefully, keeping his hands visible and moving slowly. "I save you from river. You almost die." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she studied his face in the firelight. She had expected to see the cold calculation she knew so well from the men in her life, but instead found something different, genuine concern, mixed with what looked almost like respect. "You're Indian," she said, as if just realizing it. "Comanche?" Ayanna nodded slowly. "My name Ayanna, mean eternal blossom in my language. What they call you?" The simple question caught Elizabeth off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her name as if it mattered? Her husband had called her wife. His brothers had called her the barren one, or worse. But this stranger, this enemy, according to everything she had been taught, wanted to know what she called herself. "Elizabeth," she said after a long pause, though she did not lower the knife. "Elizabeth Hartwell." "Elizabeth," Ayanna repeated carefully, testing the foreign sounds on his tongue. What'd it mean? Another unexpected question. Elizabeth found herself thinking about something she had not considered in years. "It means God's promise," she said quietly. "Though I'm not sure God has kept many promises to me lately." She saw something shift in Ayanna's expression, not pity, which she would have hated, but understanding. It was the look of someone who knew what it felt like to question the fairness of the world. "River bring you to me," he said simply. "Maybe that a promise too." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Elizabeth felt her grip on the knife loosen slightly as exhaustion began to win its battle against adrenaline. Her whole body ached, and the memory of what had brought her to this place crashed over her like a wave. "They tried to kill me," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "My own family. They said I was cursed, that I brought death wherever I went." Ayanna's jaw tightened. He had suspected violence, but hearing it confirmed made his blood heat with anger. "Who do this thing?" "My husband's brothers." Elizabeth's voice turned bitter. "After James died of fever, they decided I was to blame. 3 years married and no children, you see. They said I was a witch, that I had cursed their family line." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "They dragged me from my bed in the middle of the night, tied my hands and feet. Robert the eldest put his hands around my throat and squeezed until I couldn't breathe. Said it would be a mercy to kill me quick, but then his brother suggested the river instead. 'Let God decide,' he said. 'If she's innocent, she'll float. If she's guilty, she'll sink.' The knife trembled in her hands as the memory overwhelmed her. They threw me in like I was a sack of grain, watched me go under. I heard them laughing as the current carried me away." Ayanna felt a rage building in his chest, unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had fought enemies before, had killed men who threatened his people, but this was different. This was not warfare, or even revenge. This was cruelty for its own sake, the strong preying on the weak simply because they could. "They wrong," he said fiercely. "You not cursed, you strong. River, tell me this." "How can you possibly know that?" Elizabeth's voice cracked with exhaustion and despair. "You don't know me. You don't know what I am." "I know what I see." Ayanna leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intense in the firelight. "Woman who fight when strong men try to kill her. Woman who find weapon even when weak. Woman who survive when death come calling. That not curse that medicine. That sacred power." Elizabeth stared at him, seeing something in his face that she had never encountered before. Not judgment, not calculation, not even desire, just simple acceptance of who she was in this moment. It was so foreign to her experience that she almost didn't recognize it. "Why did you save me?" she whispered. "Grandmother teach me," Ayanna replied. "She say every life has puha sacred power, to let life die when you can save it. That steal your own puha, make you less than what spirits intend." He gestured toward the knife still clutched in her hands. "You want to kill me, you kill me. But you still be alive because I choose to save life, not take it. That my medicine, my path, cannot change because you afraid." The simple honesty of his words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Here was a man who had risked his own safety to save a complete stranger, who had asked for nothing in return, who spoke of sacred duties and spiritual power as naturally as breathing. And she was threatening to murder him for his kindness. Slowly, she lowered the knife, her strength finally giving out completely. "I'm sorry," she said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I don't know who to trust anymore." Ayanna moved carefully toward her, his hands visible and non-threatening. When she didn't raise the knife again, he knelt beside her and gently took the weapon from her unresisting fingers. "You trust yourself," he said quietly. "That enough for now." As Elizabeth collapsed back against the cave wall, sobbing with relief and exhaustion, Ayanna found himself facing a problem he had never encountered before. This woman, this Elizabeth, was not just a life he had saved. She was a person whose very existence challenged everything he thought he knew about the white world. He had been taught that white people were all the same, greedy, violent, concerned only with taking what belonged to others. But here was one who had been cast out by her own kind, who had been judged and found wanting by the very people who should have protected her. She was like him, he realized, an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit into the world she had been born into. The recognition sent a strange warmth through his chest, a feeling he had never experienced before but somehow understood instinctively. As her sobs quieted and her breathing steadied, Ayanna began to understand that saving Elizabeth's life had been the easy part. Figuring out what to do with her now that she was alive, that was going to be much more complicated. The scream shattered the afternoon, quiet like a rock through glass, sending birds exploding from their roosts in the trees above the cave. Elizabeth jerked awake from her first peaceful sleep in days, her heart hammering against her ribs as the terrifying sound echoed off the canyon walls. Ayanna was on his feet instantly, his rifle in his hands and his body coiled for action. But as his eyes swept the area around their hidden shelter, he saw no immediate threat. The scream had come from somewhere downstream, distant but unmistakably human and unmistakably female. "What was that?" Elizabeth whispered, pulling the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders. She had been recovering her strength for 2 days now, eating the rabbit stew Ayanna had prepared and listening to his stories about life with the Comanche. But the sound that had just torn through the peaceful afternoon brought all her fears rushing back. "Another woman," Ayanna said grimly, his trained ear picking out details that Elizabeth had missed. "In trouble." The scream came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of horses' hooves and men's voices raised in harsh laughter. Ayanna's expression darkened as he recognized the language English, spoken with the rough accents of frontier settlers. "Stay here," he commanded, checking the loads in his rifle. "Keep fire low. Make no sound." But Elizabeth was already struggling to her feet, determination overriding her physical weakness. "If there's another woman in danger, I have to help." "You barely stand," Ayanna pointed out reasonably. "What help you give?" "I know how men like that think," Elizabeth replied, her blue eyes blazing with sudden fury. "I know what they're capable of. Maybe I can talk to them, reason with them." Ayanna almost laughed at the naive suggestion, but the bitter expression on Elizabeth's face told him she knew exactly how unlikely that was. She was volunteering anyway, which told him something important about the kind of person she was beneath all that pain and fear. The voices were getting closer now, and Ayanna could make out individual words through the canyon's natural echo. "Hold her still," someone shouted. "She's slippery as a greased pig." "Please," came a younger voice high with terror. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just gathering berries." Elizabeth's face went white. "She's just a child," she breathed. "We have to do something." Ayanna's mind raced through possibilities. 3 voices, maybe 4 men total based on the sound of the horses. Armed, certainly, and probably drunk given the time of day and their reckless noise. Fighting them directly would be suicide, but there might be other options. "You want to help?" he asked Elizabeth quietly. "Then do exactly what I say. No questions, no arguments." Elizabeth nodded, seeing something in his expression that reminded her that this gentleman, who had saved her life, was also a warrior trained from childhood in the arts of survival and combat. "They come upstream, following river," Ayanna explained quickly. "I go down, get ahead of them. You wait here until you hear my signal hawk call, 3 times. Then you make noise, distract them, make them look toward cave." "What's your signal going to accomplish?" Elizabeth asked. "Give me chance to get girl away from them." Ayanna's smile was sharp as a blade. Hard to hurt someone when you cannot find them. Before Elizabeth could protest the dangerous plan, Ayanna was gone, moving through the underbrush with the silent grace that had made the Comanche feared throughout the Texas plains. She was left alone with the growing sounds of approaching violence and the knowledge that a child's life hung in the balance. The men appeared around the river, bent like something from a nightmare. 4 of them, just as Ayanna had predicted, mounted on horses and dragging something behind them. As they came closer, Elizabeth could see what they were pulling: a young girl, perhaps 15 years old, with the dark hair and olive skin that marked her as Mexican. Her dress was torn, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but her spirit was clearly unbroken as she continued to fight against the ropes that bound her hands. "Stupid little bean-eater," one of the men snarled, dismounting to jerk her roughly to her feet. "Should have stayed on your own side of the river." "My father will pay you," the girl said in accented but clear English. "Whatever you want, he will give you. Just let me go home." The men laughed, and Elizabeth felt sick at the sound. She had heard that same cruel laughter the night her brothers-in-law had dragged her to the river. It was the sound men made when they knew they held all the power and intended to use it badly. "Your papa's money ain't what we're interested in, little dove," the apparent leader said, his scarred face splitting in an ugly grin. "We got other ideas about payment." The girl's eyes went wide with understanding and terror. Elizabeth felt rage building in her chest like a fire, burning away fear and weakness and every instinct that told her to stay hidden. This child was facing the same fate Elizabeth herself had barely escaped. and she would be damned if she was going to hide in a cave while it happened. But before she could move, the sound she had been waiting for drifted down from somewhere upstream, 3 perfect hawk calls that could have been made by any bird if you didn't know better. Ayanna was in position. Elizabeth took a deep breath and stepped out of the cave's concealment, her chin raised and her voice carrying clearly across the water. Let her go. The 4 men spun toward her voice, their hands dropping instinctively to their weapons. The leader's scarred face twisted with surprise, and something uglier as he took in her appearance a white woman, clearly well-bred despite her current disheveled state, standing alone and unafraid on the wrong side of the river. Well, well, he drawled, his eyes crawling over her in a way that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. Looks like it's our lucky day, boys. 2 birds for the price of 1. You have no quarrel with that child, Elizabeth said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. She's done nothing to you. Neither have you, I reckon, the man replied. But that ain't stopped us from having ideas. He gestured to his companions. Martinez, you and Collins stay with the little pepper. Jake, you come with me. Let's go collect our other prize. As 2 of the men spurred their horses toward the river, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of movement in the trees behind them. Ayanna was there, invisible to everyone but her, moving like a shadow toward where the girl was being held. Elizabeth forced herself to keep talking, to hold the men's attention. You don't want to do this, she said, backing slowly toward the deeper part of the canyon. I'm not what I appear to be. The leader laughed as his horse splashed into the shallows. What are you then, darling? Some kind of witch? The word hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, bringing back memories of her brothers-in-law and their accusations. But instead of the old shame and fear, she felt something else rising in her chest, a dark amusement at the irony of the situation. As a matter of fact, she said, her voice taking on an eerie quality as it echoed off the canyon walls, that's exactly what I am. Behind the advancing men, she saw Ayanna strike with the speed and silence of a hunting cat. One moment the girl was bound and helpless. The next, she was gone, vanished into the trees as if she had never existed. The 2 men left to guard her were looking around in confusion, their voices raised in alarm. Where'd she go? One of them shouted. She was right here. The leader turned in his saddle, his face darkening with rage as he realized they had been tricked. Find her, he roared. She can't have gone far. But Elizabeth was already moving, melting back into the shadows of the canyon as Ayanna had taught her. The men crashed through the underbrush like angry bears, their curses echoing off the stone walls, but they were hunting ghosts now. From her hiding place deep in the cave, Elizabeth listened to their frustrated search and felt something she had not experienced in years, the satisfaction of victory. She and Ayanna had saved the girl, had turned the hunters into the hunted, and had done it without firing a single shot. When the men finally gave up and rode away, their voices fading into the distance, Elizabeth allowed herself to smile for the first time since her ordeal began. Maybe she was cursed, after all cursed, to be a thorn in the side of men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. If so, it was a curse she could learn to live with. Gracias, gracias. The girl's voice trembled with tears as she clutched Elizabeth's hands 3 hours later, safe inside the hidden cave. You saved my life, both of you. Maria Esperanza Valdez was her full name. She had told them in rapid Spanish before switching to careful English. 15 years old, daughter of a wealthy rancher whose lands stretched far south of the Rio Grande. She had been picking wild berries near the river when the men found her, crossing into Texas territory to hunt and cause trouble. Your papa? He know you here? Ayanna asked gently, offering the girl dried meat from his pack. He had retrieved her after the men gave up their search, finding her hidden in a hollow tree where his whispered instructions had guided her. Maria shook her head, ashamed. I sneak away. Mama always say stay close to house, but I want to see American side of river. Want to pick the sweet berries that grow only here. She looked up at Elizabeth with dark eyes full of regret. Now I understand why she worries so much. Elizabeth felt her heart squeeze with sympathy for this brave, foolish girl who reminded her so much of herself at that age, always pushing boundaries, always convinced she could handle whatever the world threw at her. before her marriage had taught her how wrong such confidence could be. Your family will be worried sick, Elizabeth said softly. How far is your home? 2 days ride south, maybe 3 on foot. Maria's voice grew small. Papa has many men searching by now, but they look on Mexican side. They not think to cross river. Ayana stood suddenly, his head tilted as if listening to something the women could not hear. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the sound of horses moving at a steady pace. But these were different from the rough riders who had terrorized Maria earlier. These moved with discipline and purpose. Someone comes, he said quietly, reaching for his rifle. Many horses, moving like soldiers. Maria's face went pale. My father's men, she whispered. They found me. But as the sounds grew closer, Elizabeth heard something that made her blood run cold. English voices, calling orders with military precision, and underneath it all, a voice she recognized with sick certainty. Robert, she breathed, the name falling from her lips like a curse. Through the cave entrance, they could see riders emerging from the morning mist. Least a dozen men, some in the rough clothes of frontier settlers, others wearing the blue uniforms of Texas Rangers. And leading them all, sitting his horse like a conquering general, was Robert Hartwell. Elizabeth's brother-in-law had changed in the weeks since she had last seen him. His face was harder, more determined, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of a man who had convinced himself he was doing God's work. Behind him rode his younger brother William, along with faces Elizabeth recognized from their small settlement. Spread out, Robert's voice echoed off the canyon walls. She's here somewhere. That Indian devil has her, and we're going to get her back. Alive, you said, called one of the rangers, a lean man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. Your sister-in-law comes back alive, or we don't get paid. Of course alive, Robert replied smoothly. Poor Elizabeth, driven mad with grief, running off with a savage because her mind snapped after my brother's death. We're here to bring her home, get her the help she needs. Elizabeth felt sick as she listened to the lies flowing so easily from Robert's lips. He had rewritten history, turned attempted murder into a rescue mission, and the Rangers were believing every word. What we do? Ayana asked quietly, checking his weapons. Many men cannot fight all. You don't fight any of them, Elizabeth said firmly. This is my problem, not yours. Take Maria and get away from here. Get her back to her family. No, the word came out sharp as a blade. I not leave you to face alone. Look at them, Elizabeth hissed, gesturing toward the riders. They're not just my family anymore. They've got law with them, official backing. If they find you here with me, they'll hang you as a kidnapper and murderer. Is that what your grandmother's teachings say, to throw your life away for nothing? Ayana's jaw clenched, but Elizabeth could see the truth of her words hitting home. A Comanche warrior found with a white woman would not get a trial, would not get a chance to explain. He would get a rope. Besides, Elizabeth continued, her mind racing through possibilities, someone needs to make sure Maria gets home safely. Her father probably has men searching the wrong places. You know this country better than anyone. What about you? Maria asked, her young voice filled with concern. What will you do? Elizabeth looked toward the cave entrance, where Robert's voice continued to ring out with false concern and hidden menace. For weeks, she had been running from the consequences of other people's choices, letting their hatred and fear define who she was and what she was worth. But something had changed during her time in this cave with Ayana. She had remembered what it felt like to be valued for who she was, not judged for what she could not give. She had tasted the sweetness of being seen as strong rather than cursed, as a partner rather than property. I'm going to stop running, she said quietly. It's time to face the truth, whatever the cost. Ayana stared at her, seeing something in her expression that had not been there when he pulled her from the river. This was not the broken, desperate woman who had threatened him with a knife. This was someone who had found her strength again, who was ready to use it. Elizabeth, he said softly, using her full name for the first time, if you do this thing, you may not survive. These men, they not want truth. They want you quiet, gone. I know, she replied, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. But I can't keep letting them win. If I run now, I'll be running forever. And maybe if I tell the Rangers what really happened, some of them will listen. It was a desperate plan, built more on hope than logic. But it was her plan, her choice, and that made all the difference. Outside, Robert was organizing his men into search parties, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. She's desperate now, probably starving. The savage who took her might try to trade her for supplies, so check every camp, every hideout, and remember she's not in her right mind. She might resist rescue, might even defend her captor. Don't let that stop you from doing what's necessary. Elizabeth closed her eyes, listening to her own character being assassinated with surgical precision. Robert was setting up the perfect story, the mad widow who had to be saved from herself, whose protests would only prove her insanity. Go, she said to Ayanna and Maria, while you still can. Take the back trail through the high rocks. They won't follow you that way. I will remember you, Maria said solemnly, hugging Elizabeth with the fierce intensity of youth. I will tell my father how brave you are. Maybe, he can help somehow. Ayanna said nothing, but his dark eyes held a promise that Elizabeth understood without words. This was not goodbye forever. Somehow, some way, their paths would cross again. As the two of them slipped away through the cave's hidden rear exit, Elizabeth prepared to face the demons of her past. She smoothed her hair, straightened her borrowed clothes, and walked toward the cave entrance with her head held high. It was time to remind Robert Hartwell that some women refuse to stay buried. Hello, Robert. Elizabeth's voice rang clear and strong across the canyon as she stepped into full view of the search party. You seem surprised to see me alive. The effect of her appearance was everything she had hoped for and more. Robert's horse shied backward as if it had seen a ghost, and the man himself went pale as winter snow. Behind him, the other riders muttered among themselves, clearly confused by Elizabeth's calm, unharmed appearance. Elizabeth? Robert recovered quickly, his voice filling with false relief. Thank God you're safe. We've been searching for days. When you disappeared from your room that night, we feared the worst. Did you? Elizabeth asked pleasantly, walking closer with measured steps. How strange. I remember you being there when I disappeared. In fact, I remember you helping quite a bit with the process. The Texas Ranger sergeant urged his horse forward, studying Elizabeth with professional eyes. She looked nothing like the mad, broken woman Robert had described. Her clothes were strange, too large, clearly borrowed, but her posture was straight, her gaze steady, and her voice carried no trace of hysteria. Ma'am, the sergeant said politely, I'm Sergeant Morrison, Texas Rangers. Your family reported you missing, said you'd been taken by hostiles. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention? How thoughtful of you to ask, Elizabeth replied, her eyes never leaving Robert's face. I am indeed injured, Sergeant, but not by any hostiles, unless you count my own in-laws in that category. A ripple of unease ran through the assembled men. This was not the reunion they had been expecting. Elizabeth, Robert said urgently, you're not well. The grief of losing James has affected your mind. You're confused, saying things that don't make sense. Am I? Elizabeth's voice turned sharp as broken glass. Then perhaps you can explain these to the good sergeant. She pulled down the neck of her borrowed shirt, revealing the dark purple bruises that still marked her throat. Then she held up her wrists, showing the rope burns that had not yet fully healed. I got these marks the night you and William dragged me from my bed, she said clearly. The night you called me a witch and a curse. The night you tried to strangle me and then threw me in the river to drown. The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the Rangers exchanged glances, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Whatever they had expected to find, it was not this. You're sick, Robert said desperately, but sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. James's death broke your mind. You've invented this fantasy to explain why you ran away. Have I? Elizabeth turned to address the Rangers directly. Then perhaps one of you gentlemen can explain how a woman invents rope burns and finger marks that match exactly the span of my brother-in-law's hands. Sergeant Morrison was studying the marks on Elizabeth's throat with the trained eye of a man who had seen plenty of violence. "Those are real," he said quietly, "and fresh. Maybe 2 weeks old. Elizabeth disappeared exactly 2 weeks ago." William Hartwell spoke up for the first time, his voice lacking his brother's confidence. "The same night." "Coincidence," Robert snapped, but his authority was cracking like ice in spring. "She's been living rough, probably got those marks fighting through brush, falling down. Fighting for her life, more likely," said another voice. Everyone turned to see a new rider approaching an older man in expensive clothes, accompanied by a dozen vaqueros armed to the teeth. Maria Valdez sat behind him on his horse, safe and unharmed, and even from a distance Elizabeth could see the family resemblance. "Don Alejandro Valdez," the man introduced himself as he dismounted, "and I believe I have information relevant to this discussion." He helped Maria down from the horse, and the girl immediately ran to Elizabeth's side. "Papa, this is the woman I told you about. She and the Comanche saved me from bad men." "Sí, mija." Don Alejandro's eyes were hard as flint as he studied the assembled rangers and settlers. "My daughter tells me interesting story. About how this woman and Indian warrior save her from men who would hurt her. About how she risked her own safety to help stranger." "That's impossible," Robert protested. "Elizabeth has been missing, probably held prisoner." "My daughters say different." Don Alejandro cut him off. "She say this woman choose to face danger rather than hide in safety. She say this woman has courage. Does not sound like mad person to me." Sergeant Morrison was putting pieces together with the methodical precision of a man trained to investigate crimes. "Mr. Hartwell," he said slowly, "when you reported your sister-in-law missing, you said she wandered off in the night. You didn't mention any signs of struggle." "There weren't any," Robert said quickly. "She left of her own accord, in her madness." "Then how do you explain these injuries?" Morrison gestured toward Elizabeth's still visible bruises. "Fresh rope burns don't come from wandering around confused." "She could have gotten them anywhere," William said, but his voice was weak and uncertain. "Living in the wild. Maybe the Indians who took her." "What Indians?" Maria spoke up boldly. "The Comanche who helped us was kind man, gentle man. He never hurt anyone, only saved people." Elizabeth felt a warm rush of gratitude toward the brave girl, but she kept her focus on the rangers. This was her moment, perhaps her only chance to tell the truth and be believed. "Sergeant Morrison," she said formally, "I request protection under Texas law while I make a full statement about what happened to me. About how my brothers-in-law attempted to murder me and would have succeeded if not for the intervention of others." "This is ridiculous." Robert's composure finally shattered completely. "She's a barren woman, probably a witch. James died within 3 years of marrying her, and she never gave him a child. What more proof do you need that she's cursed?" The words hung in the air like poison, and Elizabeth felt the familiar shame trying to crawl up her throat. But this time, she was ready for it. "You're right," she said calmly. "I never gave James children, but that doesn't make me cursed, Robert. It just makes me unlucky, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to commit murder." She turned to face the rangers fully, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am Elizabeth Hartwell, widow of James Hartwell, and I am not mad. I am not cursed. I am a woman who survived attempted murder by her own family, and I demand justice under the law." Sergeant Morrison was nodding slowly, his professional instincts telling him that truth was finally being spoken. But before he could respond, Robert made one last, desperate play. "She's been living with a savage," he shouted. "A Comanche warrior, for weeks. She's been defiled, corrupted. No decent white woman would." "Would what?" Elizabeth interrupted, her voice cutting like a whip. "Would refuse to die quietly when you tried to kill her? Would accept help from someone who showed her kindness when her own family showed her only cruelty?" She stepped closer to Robert, and for the first time in their long, bitter relationship, she saw fear in his eyes. "Yes, I was helped by a Comanche warrior," she said clearly. "A man with more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire body. A man who saved my life, and asked for nothing in return except that I value the gift he had given me. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the whisper of wind through the canyon and the nervous shifting of horses. Elizabeth stood in the center of it all, no longer the victim or the accused, but something new, entirely woman, who had found her voice and refused to be silenced. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I believe you have enough evidence to make some arrests." Morrison's hand was already moving toward his handcuffs. The iron shackles clicked shut around Robert's wrists with a sound like breaking bones, but his eyes burned with rage that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "This isn't over," he hissed as Sergeant Morrison secured the chains. "You think these rangers will protect you forever? You think that savage lover of yours will keep you safe?" "That's enough," Morrison said firmly, but Elizabeth could see the uncertainty in his face. Arresting a prominent settler on the word of a woman, even one with clear evidence of abuse, was not something Texas Rangers did lightly in 1847. William Hartwell had already started backing his horse away from the group, his face pale with fear. "I had nothing to do with this," he called out desperately. "It was all Robert's idea. I just followed along." "Stand fast, William," Morrison ordered. "You're coming with us too. We'll sort out degrees of guilt back in town." But William was already spurring his horse toward the canyon mouth, panic overriding any remaining sense. 3 rangers took off after him, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they pursued the fleeing man through the rocky terrain. Don Alejandro had been watching the proceedings with the sharp eyes of a man who understood politics as well as justice. Now he moved his horse closer to Elizabeth, his voice low and urgent. "Senora, this victory may be short-lived," he said quietly. "Men like your brother-in-law have friends, influence. They will not let this stand without a fight." Elizabeth nodded, having reached the same conclusion herself. "What do you suggest?" "Come south with me," Don Alejandro said without hesitation. "My lands extend far beyond the reach of Texas law. You would be safe there, protected, free to build a new life." The offer was generous, more than generous. Elizabeth could picture a peaceful existence on a wealthy Mexican ranch, far from the hatred and suspicion that had poisoned her life in Texas. She would be safe, comfortable, forgotten. But something in her chest rebelled against the idea of running again, even to safety. "I'm grateful for your kindness," she said carefully, "but I can't keep running from who I am. If I disappear now, Robert's story becomes the truth. I become the mad woman who ran off with savages, and every other woman who faces what I faced will have one less person willing to speak for her." Maria, who had been listening intently, suddenly gripped Elizabeth's arm. "The Comanche," she whispered urgently. "Your friend, where did he go?" Elizabeth's heart lurched as she realized the girl was right to be concerned. In all the drama of Robert's arrest, she had lost track of where Ayanna might be. He had promised to take Maria to safety. And then, what? He would not simply abandon her. She knew that much, which meant he was probably watching from somewhere nearby, ready to help if needed. Which also meant he was in terrible danger. "Sergeant Morrison," she said quickly, "the Comanche warrior who helped save Maria, he's not a threat. He saved both our lives and asked for nothing in return." Morrison's weathered face was skeptical. "Ma'am, I appreciate everything you've been through, but harboring hostile Indians is still a crime in Texas. If this warrior is nearby—" "He's not hostile," Elizabeth protested. "He's a good man who acted with honor when my own family tried to murder me." "The law doesn't make distinctions like that," Morrison replied, though not unkindly. "Any Indian found off the reservation is considered a threat. My orders are clear." Don Alejandro leaned forward in his saddle. "Perhaps the law is wrong, Sargento. My daughter tells me this man showed great courage and kindness. Does that count for nothing?" "It counts for plenty, in my personal opinion," Morrison said honestly. "But it doesn't change what I have to do if I find him." Elizabeth felt desperation rising in her throat. After everything they had been through together, she could not bear the thought of Ayanna being hunted down like an animal because he had chosen to help her. "Then don't find him," she said quietly. Morrison stared at her. "Ma'am?" "I'm asking you, as a favor to a woman who has already lost too much, to give him time to get away. He's no threat to anyone. He just wants to go home to his people. The sergeant was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the canyon walls, where shadows moved in the afternoon light. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I reckon we've got our hands full with these prisoners," he said. "Might take us a while to organize a proper search. Lots of places a man could hide in country like this." Elizabeth felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Morrison warned. "Your troubles are just beginning. Robert Hartwell has friends in high places, and they're not going to take kindly to seeing him in chains. You'll need to be smart about what comes next." As if summoned by his words, the sound of more horses echoed through the canyon. But these were different from the Rangers' disciplined formation. These riders moved with the aggressive haste of men on a mission of vengeance. "Dios mío," Don Alejandro breathed, shading his eyes to peer at the approaching dust cloud. "How many?" Morrison was already counting, his face grim. 20, maybe 25, armed and riding hard. Elizabeth felt her heart sink as she recognized the lead rider, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, Robert's closest friend and the most powerful man in their county. Behind him rode a mix of settlers, hired guns, and men Elizabeth recognized from the local militia. "Well," she said quietly, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded, "I suppose we're about to find out how much justice is really worth in Texas. Release Robert Hartwell immediately." Judge Blackwood's voice boomed across the canyon like thunder, his black coat flapping behind him as he rode. "You have no authority to arrest a respected citizen on the word of a madwoman." Sergeant Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "Judge Blackwood, I wasn't expecting to see you out here." "Someone had to come restore sanity to this situation," Blackwood replied, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man 20 years younger. At 60, he was still imposing tall, silver-haired, with eyes like winter ice, and a voice that had swayed juries for 3 decades. "Robert sent word about his sister-in-law's condition before he rode out," Blackwood continued, his gaze fixing on Elizabeth with undisguised contempt. "Poor woman, driven mad by grief, making wild accusations against the very family trying to help her." Elizabeth had known this moment would come, but facing Blackwood still made her stomach clench with remembered fear. This was the man who had ruled her small community like a king for as long as she could remember, whose word was law and whose friendships were armor against any accusation. "Your Honor," Morrison said carefully, "I've seen evidence that suggests Mrs. Hartwell's accusations have merit. Physical evidence." "Evidence?" Blackwood laughed, the sound cold as a winter wind. "What evidence could there be for such fantasies? The woman has clearly been living rough, probably injured herself in her madness." He gestured toward the men behind him. "I've brought proper escort to take Elizabeth home, where she can receive the medical care she obviously needs." Elizabeth looked at the faces of Blackwood's party and felt her hope crumble. These were not men interested in justice or truth. These were men protecting their own interests, their own vision of how the world should work. But before despair could take hold, a new voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary, Judge." Everyone turned to see Don Alejandro stepping forward, flanked by his vaqueros. The Mexican rancher might have been outnumbered, but his men were professional, seasoned fighters who had been protecting his lands for years. "This matter involves my daughter," Don Alejandro continued smoothly. "She was assaulted by American citizens on American soil, and this woman helped save her life. I have a legal interest in seeing justice done." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "You have no jurisdiction here, Valdez. This is Texas business." "See, it is Texas business," Don Alejandro agreed, "which is why I sent riders to San Antonio this morning to request federal involvement. The United States government takes a very dim view of its citizens attacking Mexican nationals, especially the daughter of a man who has extensive business dealings with American traders." Elizabeth saw Blackwood's face go pale as the implications hit him. Don Alejandro was not just a wealthy rancher, he was a man with connections that reached all the way to Washington. An international incident was the last thing anyone wanted. "You're bluffing," Blackwood said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Am I? Don Alejandro smiled coldly. Would you like to gamble your political career on that assumption? The standoff stretched taut as a violin string, 24 armed men facing each other across the canyon floor while the sun climbed higher overhead. Elizabeth found herself thinking of Ayana, hoping he was far away from this powder keg that was about to explode. Then Maria stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the adult posturing like a knife through silk. Why does no one ask what I saw? She demanded, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. I am the one who was hurt. I am the one who was saved. But you all talk like I am not here. The simple question hit everyone like a slap. Here was a 15-year-old girl showing more courage than grown men, demanding to be heard in a world that rarely listened to women at all, let alone young ones. Mija, Don Alejandro said gently, perhaps it would be better. No, Papa, Maria interrupted firmly. They say this woman is mad, but I saw her risk her life to save mine. They say the Comanche is savage, but he was kinder to me than any of these men have been. She turned to face Judge Blackwood directly, her chin raised in defiance of everything she had been taught about respecting her elders. You want to know what madness looks like? She asked. It looks like men who hurt women and call it justice. It looks like people who would rather believe lies than admit they were wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth felt her heart swell with pride for this brave girl who had found her voice when it mattered most. But Blackwood was not a man to be shamed by a child, no matter how brave. Sergeant Morrison, he said coldly, I'm ordering you to release Robert Hartwell and place Elizabeth Hartwell in protective custody for her own safety. I'm afraid you don't have that authority, Judge, Morrison replied. This is a federal matter now. He pulled a folded paper from his Pocata telegram that had arrived just before Blackwood's party. Orders from Austin. All parties involved are to be transported to San Antonio for federal review. Elizabeth stared at the sergeant in amazement. How? Morrison's weathered face cracked in a small smile. Don Alejandro wasn't the only one who sent messages this morning. The Rangers have our own ways of making sure justice gets done. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Elizabeth felt something that might have been hope. Maybe, just maybe, there were still people in the world who cared more about truth than convenience. But as she looked at Judge Blackwood's face cold, calculating, and far from defeated, she knew the real fight was just beginning. 3 days later, the federal courthouse in San Antonio buzzed with tension like a beehive about to swarm. Elizabeth sat in the witness chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, while dozens of eyes studied her every movement. The packed courtroom held a strange mix of people, wealthy ranchers, curious townspeople, newspaper reporters, and even a few Comanche leaders who had traveled from the reservation to hear what would happen to one of their own. Federal Judge Marcus Wellington looked down at her from his high bench, his gray beard neatly trimmed and his eyes sharp with intelligence. He was known throughout Texas as a fair man, which was exactly why Don Alejandro had insisted the case be moved to federal court. Mrs. Hartwell, Judge Wellington said in a voice that carried easily through the crowded room, you have made very serious accusations against your family. Do you understand that false testimony in this court is a crime punishable by imprisonment? I understand completely, Your Honor, Elizabeth replied, her voice steady and clear. Everything I have told this court is the absolute truth. At the defendant's table, Robert Hartwell sat chained between two federal marshals, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. His expensive lawyer, brought down from Austin at Judge Blackwood's expense, shuffled through papers with the desperate energy of a man trying to build a case from nothing. Your Honor, the lawyer, a thin, nervous man named Fitzpatrick, rose to object. My client's sister-in-law has clearly suffered a mental breakdown following her husband's tragic death. Her testimony cannot be considered reliable. Objection noted and overruled, Judge Wellington said dryly. Mrs. Hartwell appears perfectly lucid to me. Please continue with your testimony, ma'am. Elizabeth took a breath and launched into the story she had told so many times. Over the past 3 days, the night of her attempted murder, the rescue by Ayana, the confrontation at the canyon. But this time, she found herself able to speak without the old shame and fear that had once made her voice shake. When Robert and William dragged me from my bed, she said clearly. Robert told me I was a curse on their family. He said I had brought bad luck to their bloodline because I couldn't give his brother children. He said the only way to break the curse was to— She paused, steadying herself, was to kill me. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Several women in the gallery nodded grimly, recognizing a story they had heard in whispered conversations throughout the frontier. And what happened next? Judge Wellington prompted gently. They tied my hands and feet. Robert put his hands around my throat and squeezed until I couldn't breathe. Then they carried me to the river and threw me in, expecting me to drown. But you didn't drown. No, Your Honor. A Comanche warrior named Ayana found me and saved my life. At those words, Elizabeth saw something that made her heart skip, a familiar figure sitting in the back corner of the courtroom, partially hidden by shadows but unmistakably real. Ayana had come, despite the danger, despite the fact that his very presence in this courthouse could result in his arrest or worse. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and Elizabeth saw him nod slightly, a silent message of support that gave her strength to continue. Mrs. Hartwell, Fitzpatrick interrupted, rising from his chair with theatrical urgency. Isn't it true that you have been living in sin with this savage for weeks? That your testimony is colored by your unnatural attachment to him? The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers, but Elizabeth felt no shame at the accusation. Instead, she felt something like pride. I have been living under the protection of a man who saved my life and asked for nothing in return, she said firmly. A man who showed me more honor and kindness than my own family ever did. If that's what you call sin, then I'm proud to be a sinner. Judge Wellington banged his gavel for order, but Elizabeth could see approval in his eyes. In the gallery, Don Alejandro was smiling, while Maria sat beside him with tears of pride streaming down her young face. Your Honor, came another voice from the back of the room, I request permission to address the court. Everyone turned to see Ayana standing, his tall frame clearly visible now as he stepped forward. He wore his finest buckskins and carried himself with the dignified bearing of a Comanche warrior, but Elizabeth could see the tension in his shoulders. Every man in that room was armed, and most would consider him an enemy. This is highly irregular, Fitzpatrick protested. A savage has no standing in federal court. The Comanche Nation has treaty rights with the United States government, Judge Wellington replied coolly. This man has every right to speak. Come forward, sir. As Ayana walked down the center aisle, Elizabeth felt her heart hammering with fear for his safety, but she also felt overwhelming gratitude that he would risk everything to stand with her in this moment. Your Honor, Ayana said when he reached the front of the courtroom, his English careful but clear. I am Ayana of the Kotsoteca band. I come to speak truth about what happened by river. Go ahead, Wellington encouraged. White woman nearly dead when I find her, Ayana said, his dark eyes sweeping the courtroom. Bruises on throat, rope marks on wrists. Someone tried to kill her, throw her away like broken thing. He turned to look directly at Robert, and Elizabeth saw her brother-in-law flinch under that steady gaze. But she not broken, Ayana continued. She strong. She fight. She save other woman when bad men try to hurt her. She show courage, show honor. He paused, his voice growing softer. She show me white people not all same. Some have good hearts, like my grandmother teach. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on Ayana's words. In my people's way, he said, woman who survive death, who help others, who choose strength over fear, this woman has great puha, great medicine. She not cursed, she blessed. Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this brave man defend her to a room full of people who had been taught to see him as less than human. Thank you, Judge Wellington said quietly. That was illuminating. As Ayana returned to his seat, Elizabeth saw the faces in the courtroom beginning to change. Doubt was creeping into expressions that had been certain, questions replacing easy assumptions. But Robert's lawyer was not finished fighting. Your Honor, Fitzpatrick said desperately, regardless of what this Indian claims, the fact remains that my client is a respected member of his community. While the plaintiff is a woman with a clear history of instability, What history? Judge Wellington asked sharply. Fitzpatrick fumbled with his papers. Well, she was unable to bear children, which clearly indicates— Indicates what, counselor? Wellington's voice was ice cold. That she's defective? That she deserves to be murdered for failing to produce offspring? The lawyer's face went red. That's not what I meant. I think it's exactly what you meant, Wellington replied. And I think this court has heard enough testimony to reach a verdict. Elizabeth held her breath as the judge shuffled through his notes, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just her future, but the future of every woman who might face similar accusations. Robert Hartwell. Judge Wellington's voice rang through the silent courtroom like a church bell. You have been found guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. The gavel came down with a sound like breaking thunder, and Elizabeth felt her knees go weak with relief. Behind her, she heard Maria's sob of joy and Don Alejandro's quiet, gracias a Dios. But Robert was far from finished. He lunged to his feet despite his shackles, his face twisted with rage and desperation. This is insanity, he shouted. You're taking the word of a barren witch and a savage over a God-fearing Christian man. Mr. Hartwell, Wellington said coldly, you will control yourself or be removed from this courtroom. Removed? Robert laughed bitterly. By who? Federal marshals? You think this ends here? You think the good people of Texas will stand for this? Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine at his words. Even in defeat, Robert was promising future trouble. The good people of Texas, Wellington replied, will follow the law, just as you will. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years hard labor at the federal penitentiary. As the marshals dragged Robert away, still shouting threats and curses, Elizabeth found herself searching the courtroom for Ayanna. But his seat was empty. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared, leaving only the memory of his courage and the echo of his words. Outside the courthouse, the Texas sun blazed down on a crowd of reporters and curious onlookers. Elizabeth found herself surrounded by questions and shouted comments, some supportive, others hostile. Mrs. Hartwell, what do you plan to do now? Is it true you're in love with the Comanche? How does it feel to send your own family to prison? Elizabeth raised her hand for quiet, surprised when the crowd actually listened. I plan to rebuild my life, she said simply, and I hope that other women who face what I faced will know they don't have to accept injustice silently. A young reporter from the San Antonio newspaper pushed forward. But what about the allegations regarding your relationship with the Indian? Don't you think decent society has a right to know? Decent society, Elizabeth interrupted, has a right to know that a Comanche warrior showed me more decency and respect than my own family ever did. If that troubles your sense of propriety, perhaps you should examine your own values. The reporter's face reddened, but before he could respond, Don Alejandro's voice cut through the noise. Senora Elizabeth will be traveling south with my family for a time, he announced. She needs rest and healing after her ordeal. Elizabeth turned to him in surprise. They had discussed this possibility, but she had not yet given him an answer. Don Alejandro, I'm grateful, but— No arguments, he said firmly, but his eyes were kind. Maria insists, and my daughter always gets what she wants. Besides, he lowered his voice, it may not be safe for you here for a while. Robert Hartwell has many friends, and not all of them will accept this verdict gracefully. Elizabeth knew he was right. The trial might be over, but the consequences were just beginning. Robert's words in the courtroom had been a promise as much as a threat. As they walked toward Don Alejandro's waiting carriage, Elizabeth caught sight of a familiar figure standing beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of the town square. Ayanna was watching her from the shadows, his dark eyes unreadable. Go to him, Maria whispered, having noticed Elizabeth's gaze. My father and I will wait. Elizabeth walked slowly toward the tree, her heart pounding with uncertainty. What did you say to someone who had saved your life and then risked his own to defend you in court? You came, she said when she reached him. You need someone to speak for you, Ayanna replied simply. My words have power too, even in white man's court. It was dangerous. If someone had recognized you from the canyon. Many things dangerous, he said with a slight smile. River dangerous, men with guns dangerous, but sometimes danger necessary. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the bustle of the town around them. Elizabeth knew this might be the last time she saw him. Don Alejandro's ranch was hundreds of miles south, and Ayana's people would be returning to their winter ground soon. What will you do now, she asked. Return to my band. Tell them what I learned about white justice, white courage. He looked at her meaningfully. Tell them not all white people same. And I'll tell them about Comanche honor, Elizabeth replied, about a warrior who saved a stranger and asked for nothing. Ayana reached into his buckskin shirt and pulled out something that made Elizabeth's breath catch the smooth river stone he had shown her in the cave, the one his grandmother had given him. For you, he said, placing it in her palm, to remember that river not take you. River give you new life, new strength. Elizabeth closed her fingers around the warm stone, feeling its weight like a promise. I can't take this. It's your grandmother's. She say I know when right time come, Ayana interrupted. Time is now. Elizabeth looked up into his dark eyes and saw something there that made her heart ache with possibility and loss all at once. In another world, another time, perhaps they could have found a way to bridge the gap between their peoples, their lives. But this was 1847 Texas, and some bridges were not yet ready to be built. Thank you, she whispered, and meant it for everything, the rescue, the protection, the friendship, the reminder that she was worth saving. You welcome, he replied, using the English phrase carefully. Then he added something in Comanche that she didn't understand but felt in her bones a blessing, a farewell, a promise that their paths had crossed for a reason. As he melted back into the shadows like smoke on the wind, Elizabeth clutched the river stone and felt something she had never experienced before, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly who she was meant to become. The trial was over, but her real life was just beginning. 5 years later, Elizabeth stood on the wide veranda of Don Alejandro's hacienda, watching the sun paint the Mexican hills gold and crimson as it set behind the mountains. The river stone from Ayana hung on a thin leather cord around her neck, a reminder of the woman she had been and the strength she had found in her darkest hour. Senora Elizabeth, Maria's voice called from the courtyard below, though she was no longer the frightened 15-year-old girl Elizabeth had first met. At 20, Maria had grown into a confident young woman with her father's sharp mind and her mother's gentle heart. The messenger has returned from San Antonio. Elizabeth hurried down the stone steps, her heart racing with anticipation. For months, she'd been exchanging letters with other women, across Texas women, who had read about her trial in the newspapers and reached out with their own stories of abuse, abandonment, and survival. What had started as simple correspondence had grown into something much larger. The messenger, a young vaquero named Carlos, dismounted and handed her a leather satchel bulging with papers. Many letters this time, Senora, he said with a grin, and this special one from the capital. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she opened the official-looking envelope with the state seal. Inside was a letter that made her heart soar with disbelief. What is it? Maria asked, seeing the stunned expression on Elizabeth's face. The governor, Elizabeth whispered, has signed the bill into law. The Texas Women's Protection Act is now official. The law was modest by any measure. It simply made it illegal for family members to harm women for being unable to bear children, and established the right of women to testify against their attackers in court. But it was a beginning, the first crack in a wall that had seemed unbreakable. Papa, Maria called excitedly, come quickly, the law has passed. Don Alejandro emerged from his study, his hair now completely silver, but his step still strong. Over the years, he had become Elizabeth's greatest supporter in her quiet campaign for women's rights, using his political connections and wealth to advance causes that others dismissed as foolish fantasies. Mija, he said, embracing Elizabeth warmly, you have done something remarkable. Your grandmother would be proud. The mention of his mother brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. The old woman had died the previous winter, but not before making Elizabeth promise to continue the work they had started, together teaching women to read and write, helping them understand their legal rights, and providing sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn. "There's more," Elizabeth said, pulling another letter from the satchel. "The women's group in Austin wants to establish a school. They're asking if I would consider returning to Texas to run it." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Elizabeth had found peace and purpose in Mexico, building a life that fulfilled her in ways she had never imagined possible. But Texas was her homeland, and there were women there who needed the help she could provide. "You will go," Don Alejandro said quietly. It was not a question. "I don't know," Elizabeth replied honestly. "There are still people there who hate me, who would see my work as a threat to their way of life. And Robert," she paused, the name still bringing a chill to her heart. "Robert's sentence ends next year. He'll be free." Maria took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear," she said, using words Elizabeth had spoken during one of their many conversations about bravery. "It's acting despite the fear." That evening, Elizabeth walked alone through the gardens that had become her refuge over the past 5 years. The night air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and orange blossoms, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft strumming of a guitar and voices raised in gentle song. She thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived here, broken, terrified, convinced that her life was over. Don Alejandro and his family had given her time to heal, space to grow, and the freedom to discover who she really was, beneath all the pain and fear. But they had also given her something else, a sense of purpose that went beyond her own survival. The letters in her room upstairs represented dozens of women who had found the courage to reach out, to ask for help, to believe that their lives could be different. How could she abandon them now? As she walked, Elizabeth became aware of another presence in the garden. A figure stepped out from behind a flowering tree, and her heart nearly stopped as she recognized the familiar silhouette. "Ayana?" she breathed, hardly daring to believe her eyes. He looked older, his face marked by lines that spoke of weather and worry, but his dark eyes still held the same gentle strength that had saved her life all those years ago. He wore the clothes of a ranch hand-simple cotton shirt and leather pants, but carried himself with the unmistakable dignity of a Comanche warrior. "Hello, Elizabeth," he said in English that was much smoother than she remembered. "You look well. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How did you find me?" "Maria write to my cousin who work at Trading Post," he explained with a slight smile. "She think maybe I want to know about law you help make, about school you plan to build." Elizabeth felt her face grow warm. Maria had been playing matchmaker, despite Elizabeth's insistence that her connection with Ayana belonged to the past. "You've learned to write," she observed, deflecting from the emotions that were threatening to overwhelm her. "White teacher come to reservation 2 years ago," Ayana replied. "She say reading and writing important for my people's future. She right, I think." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, years of separation melting away as if they had been together yesterday. Finally, Ayana stopped beside a fountain where water trickled musically over carved stone. "Maria tell me you afraid to go back to Texas," he said quietly. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. "I understand fear," Ayana continued. "When I first leave reservation to come here, I very afraid. Not of danger, afraid of hope. Hope? Hope that may be world-changing, that maybe my people, and your people, find better way to live together." He turned to face her fully. "You give me that hope, Elizabeth. When you stand in court, when you speak truth about what happened between us, you show others that fear not have to win." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to go back, to face all of that again." Ayana reached out and gently touched the riverstone that hung around her neck. "You already strong enough," he said softly. "You just forget sometimes." In that moment, looking into his eyes under the Mexican stars, Elizabeth understood that her choice was not really about geography or safety, or even revenge against those who had wronged her. It was about who she wanted to be, the woman who hid from challenges, or the woman who faced them with courage. "If I go back," she said quietly, "will you come with me?" Ayanna's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I think maybe it's time for both of us to go home." The school stood at the edge of Austin like a declaration of war against ignorance and fear. Elizabeth had chosen the location carefully close enough to town for women to reach easily, but far enough away to avoid daily confrontations with those who opposed what they were doing. The building itself was modest but sturdy, constructed with funds donated by women across Texas who had heard about Elizabeth's work. Above the front door hung a simple wooden sign, "The Brazos River School for Women's Education." The name was Elizabeth's tribute to the place where her new life had truly begun. On this crisp morning in September 1852, Elizabeth stood in the main classroom, arranging primers and slates while nervous excitement fluttered in her stomach. Today was opening day, and she had no idea how many students would actually come. Through the window, she could see Ayanna working in the garden behind the school, his strong hands coaxing vegetables from the Texas soil. His presence here had caused quite a stir in Austin. A Comanche man working openly alongside a white woman was still shocking to many people. But he had made it clear that anyone who had a problem with his presence could take it up with him directly, and so far, no one had been brave enough to do so. The sound of horses and wagon wheels drew Elizabeth to the front window, and what she saw there made her heart leap with joy. A line of vehicles was approaching the school farm: wagons, riding horses, even a few fancy carriages from town. Women of all ages were climbing down, some nervous, some determined, all taking the first brave step toward a different kind of future. "Senora Elizabeth," Maria's voice called from the doorway. She had insisted on coming to Texas to help with the school despite her father's concerns about the danger. "They're here!" Elizabeth smoothed her simple blue dress and walked to the front door, her heart pounding with anticipation. The first woman to approach was elderly, her gray hair neatly braided, and her calloused hands speaking of a lifetime of hard work. "I'm Sarah Jenkins," she said with quiet dignity. "I never learned to read, but my granddaughter says it's never too late. Is that true?" "It's absolutely true," Elizabeth replied warmly. "Welcome to the Brazos River School." One by one, the women introduced themselves: farmers' wives, widows, young mothers, even a few unmarried girls whose families had finally agreed to let them get an education. Each had her own story, her own reasons for coming, but they all shared the same hungry look in their eyes, the look of people who had been told they didn't deserve knowledge and were finally ready to prove that wrong. As Elizabeth led them into the classroom, she caught sight of a familiar figure standing across the road. Robert Hartwell sat on horseback, watching the school with cold eyes. He had been released from prison 3 months earlier, and his presence in Austin was a constant reminder that not everyone was happy about the changes taking place. But Elizabeth no longer felt the old fear when she saw him. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by his years in prison, and by the knowledge that the world had moved on without him. More importantly, she was no longer Alanesh, was surrounded by women who had found their courage, supported by friends who believed in justice, and protected by a man who had proven that love could bridge any gap. "Mrs. Hartwell?" One of the younger students raised her hand tentatively. "What will we learn here?" Elizabeth smiled, looking around at the eager faces filling her classroom. "We'll learn to read and write, of course. But we'll also learn about the law, about our rights as citizens, about managing money and property." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "Most importantly, we'll learn that being a woman doesn't make us less valuable than anyone else." A murmur of approval ran through the room, and Elizabeth felt the same sense of purpose that had carried her through the darkest moments of her journey. "Now then," she said, picking up a piece of chalk, "let's begin with something simple but powerful. We'll start by learning to write your own names." As the women bent over their slates, carefully forming letters that represented their identity and worth, Elizabeth thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment. She had been thrown into a river to die, but instead of drowning, she had learned to swim. She had been called cursed, but had discovered that her true gift was the ability to help others find their own strength. Outside, She could see Ayanna working in the garden, and beyond him, the Texas hills stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there were more women who needed what this school could offer, women who had been told they were worthless, women who had been silenced by fear, women who had been convinced they deserved whatever cruelty life handed them. But they would learn, as Elizabeth had learned, that the river's gift was not destruction but transformation. They would discover that being different was not a curse but a blessing, and that the courage to speak truth could change not just their own lives, but the world around them. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Brazos River School, Elizabeth felt the warm weight of the river stone against her heart and smiled. The woman who had been thrown away like garbage had become a teacher, a leader, a voice for those who had none. And this was only the beginning. The river had given her life, but she had given life meaning. And in a classroom full of women learning to write their own names for the first time, that meaning was multiplying, spreading, taking root in hearts that had too long been told they didn't matter. They mattered. They all mattered. And now they knew it.